Since 1992, the Association for Distance Education and Independent Learning, formerly the American Association for Collegiate Independent Study, has been providing professional development and community for people engaged in or interested in distance learning. ADEIL's Stories and Histories series seeks to paint a picture of AACIS and ADEIL, to document the decades-long roots of the organization by gathering stories of longtime members. Deb Gearhart spent decades working in distance education and online learning as an educator and administrator. Some of her roles have included working with the Department of Distance Education at Penn State, Director of eTroy at Troy University, Vice Provost of eLearning at Ohio University, and Founding Director of e-Education Services at Dakota State University. She was active in the formation of AACIS and served a term as president. Our conversation began with her start in the field of distance education.
I got started in the field of correspondence study, then became distance education in early, I don't know, it was in the 80s, late 80s.
Okay.
I had just finished a degree in a master's degree, and I got a position as being the supervisor of the staff who did the correspondence study enrollment and lessons. And that's when I really found my calling, and that is working with adult learners. That, I just wasn't really cut out for teaching younger ages or anything, but I just loved working with adult learners, listening to their stories. As the supervisor, a lot of times I was trying to help people resolve issues so that they could keep going. And so that it started then. And the director of, it was Department of Independent Learning at first, and then it turned to the Department of Distance Education, and then eventually became World Campus at Penn State. But, so at the time, Dr. Dave Mercer was the head, and he sent me to some meetings because Penn State Department of Independent Learning was part of the continuing education unit at Penn State. So he sent me to NUCEA, the National University Continuing Education Association. And there was a division of correspondence study, or, then became like independent learning. That was one of the largest groups that met at these national, NUCEA meetings. So I got to meet a lot of people from all other different programs. And what it kind of turned into is that we started discussions about forming our own unit, and that's where AACIS developed. So we were part of NUCEA, and at Penn State, like I said, that our unit was part of continuing education. But a lot of the other programs that came, that wasn't necessarily a big continuing ed unit. Some of them, it depended on the university. Yeah. So it started out AACIS at that time. And I always liked being involved nationally and on committees. And so I stayed active in there. And it was 1999, 2000, I was president of AACIS. So I had, it's like one of your other questions. I stayed active on committees. Mm-hmm. I always had the opportunity, thanks to the supervisor of the unit, the head of the unit, of allowing me to always attend the national meetings. And then we were at LSU when I became president and stuff. So, one of the advantages was getting to meet people, as I'm sure when you go to ADEIL, getting to meet people from all across the country who were doing similar types of education and learning from them. Because there was, when you had the conference, you always came away with new ideas of things you can do. And when you said you talked to Kristen Rose, she's a very good friend of mine. Mm-hmm. In fact, it was for an online program, but I was invited to to do the review of an online program, and I had Kristen as part of the team. So I mean, we just for years did a lot of the same things together.
Yeah.
And when I was at Penn State, we started with looking at adding audio tapes and adding videotapes to the courses that we would send out. And that's where we started to have a group who was looking at then how could we design an online course. So that's kind of when I stepped away. Penn State was taking a very long time. And this was like, I'll back up a little bit.
You
In
bet.
1992, they asked me to do a project to find out how many of our students had, so we did a survey to see that had home computers.
Okay. Yeah.
Because we were looking at how can we advance the courses from just having audio tapes or videotapes to enhance it. So they started, and I found that over 50% at that time of our students did have home computers, of those who answered the survey. So we knew, in that early 90s time, that was the time to start looking at designing. And they had a group from their instructional design side that started working on that. But it had been almost 2 years and they didn't have the course finished yet. So, like me wanting to move on and looking at things, that was at the point where I ended up being interviewed for the position of director of distance education here at Dakota State University
Oh, okay.
in Madison, South Dakota.
Yeah.
That's when, and I moved here the first time in 1996. So I started working solely in online education at that point. But I got my start there at Penn State, and I was there for quite a few years was in Department of Independent Learning, became the Department of Distance Education.
Yeah.
So we definitely had at Penn State at that time had a strong independent learning program.
Yeah.
And I also, while I was working on masters there, and I wanted to show you, I don't know whether you have ever seen this book. It's The Foundations of American Distance Education, a Century of Collegiate Correspondence Study. And if you could find a copy of it in your library or something, it has, it's articles done by Von Pittman. Like a lot of the guys who were the initial first people in it. And Steve Wright and Barbara Watkins had edited it. And so it would give you a lot of insight on the course development and program development in that time. And I just that Steve Wright, Sylvia Rose, Roger Young, Von Pittman, they all wrote articles. James Andrews,
yes.
These are all people from early on there. But it would be a good book to look up and see if you could, just to give you, I mean, it's not AACIS related, but just gives you still a strong background of what independent learning was like, what correspondence study was like, and how things were done. But it's just that this is the field that helps adult learners. I was fortunate to have my parents put me through my undergrad years, and that was back in the 70s. And I'm not sure if you know who the actor Jimmy Stewart is.
Yes.
Okay, so I went to IUP, Indiana University of Pennsylvania.
Okay. Yeah.
And that was his hometown. And since I graduated in 1976, a centennial year, he was our commencement speaker. And
That's awesome.
It was just amazing. A lot of younger people now don't know who Jimmy Stewart is, but we were out in the football field because, like in a lot of places when they have huge graduation, but we were out in the football field and it started to rain and he crumpled up his notes and he just kept talking and we're getting wet. But he that slow speech that he does in the movies, that's what he does in real life too.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had an evening where he talked. We saw some of his movies, and he sat on stage and talked. That weekend before, so that was quite a memorable thing. I date myself here, but I am retired now, so
There you
I
go.
guess I can date myself. So, that's kind of the background of, where I was with independent, learning. And it was quite interesting to talk to being the supervisor, I had to sometimes deal with, issues that students had.
Yeah.
And it was always quite interesting talking to the learners,
Hmm.
because they were adult learners. It was their background, but so many of them expressed that they would not have an opportunity for post-secondary education without having, independent learning, and then, for futuring and distance ed. So
Hmm.
to me, that, not only did I find my niche with that, but I just loved, I mean, the rest of the way through my career. When I came to South Dakota, I was here for 11 years getting their program going. And then I went on to other universities. I was at Troy University,
Mm,
Ohio
yeah.
University.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I went on to have a great career. I did at here at Dakota State. I did get an opportunity to not only be an administrator, but uh, College of Education was doing jointly a program with the University of South Dakota
Mm.
to help teach some courses. They developed a master program that would do distance education. And so I had the opportunity to teach how to design courses and things like that online. So that I ended up also teaching online courses. I taught an online course when I was at Troy University too. So I got to not only be an administrator, but I also got to teach online, which that really made it special for me, because it just gives you a chance, and especially when a lot of the courses were on how to develop online courses, really gave a chance to get other generations moving into designing their own online programs.
Yeah.
So one of the other questions you asked
Hmm.
was, what roles did I have in the
Yeah.
organization? So since I always had the opportunity to attend a national thing, I got on to whatever committee that they needed me
Hmm.
to work with.
Yep.
And like I said, it culminated when I was president in 2000, 1999, 2000.
Yeah.
So, what I kind of got away from the organization then a little bit when I ended up here at Dakota State,
Hmm.
because they were involved with WCET. And I
Okay.
don't know what, yeah, familiar with WCET. So
Hmm.
I ended up becoming more involved with WCET.
Okay.
But I did at one point there, and it was when it was Kristen Rose was having ADEIL had been ADEIL by then,
Hmm.
at uh, down in Texas where she was at.
Hmm. Yep.
So I she contacted me, and I ended up bringing on a kind of an amazing young man. Well, it wasn't so young anymore, but a guy who when I was working at Ohio University at the time, and I had finally come back to an area that still had print-based courses, still did correspondence
Oh,
courses,
yeah.
and I imagine they still do. They did it for prisoner education.
Yes. Yes.
They go into the prison system.
Hmm.
So we had a guy, Shakur was his last name, and
Mm.
I'm so bad with names, but
Oh, that's okay.
he spoke as the guest speaker I said, this guy has finished, he's out of prison now. He had finished, started his education with all the print-based courses. He was like 17 when he went to prison. And he was it was one of those situations where a murder had been committed. He was not he did not do it, but he was part of the group that was there. So he ended up, at 17, it was his third strike in California. He ended up in prison for 20 years. So he was using the correspondence studies from Ohio University to get his degree. And he was out of prison and that, but he just had an amazing story because he went on with his life, but he all credited to he started with his associate degree that he could earn while he was in prison.
Yeah.
So he was the guest speaker at the conference that year. And Kristen could probably give you his full name. Shakur is all I can remember. And I think that was his last name. But, it was just so great to see somebody come to the conference and be the keynote speaker to talk about how he had turned his life around and he had done his education while in prison with independent study from Ohio University's courses. So
powerful.
So that's just one of the good stories to pass on. So let's see what I had on the notes here. And then you asked a question about, let's see on the page here. Some of my fun and favorite memories of AACIS. That's one of the big ones. And I wasn't even still involved. But there were, I had way down through here. I don't think I was ever at a conference that we just had a great time. Because it's always what the conference host, the university that hosted it, let you see of their cities and their university. So one of the ones that I remember was with Carrie Garcia and group at University of Nevada, Reno, because we had fun. We stayed in a casino. We just had fun times with our off conference hours on that. That was one. Another one when it was hosted with LSU and the side trips that they took. We took the side trip down to Baton Rouge to the French Quarter and spent some time there. So just about every conference you went to, there was always a special side trip. And so I know when we hosted the North Dakota group and us, at the SU, we hosted one time down in Sioux Falls. But what we did was a little different for the side trip because we took them out to, it was fall and that, and we took them out to those cornfields where you do the maze. So we took them to a corn maze that they had to walk their way through. And I got a lot of comments about how great they thought that was. It was, we took South Dakota's known for its beef, so we had a big steak dinner and then took them on the side trip to a corn maze. So, there's just, what it is about every conference is that they welcomed you to their university and to their local city. And, and we just always had great side trips. And so you got to meet these friends and you look forward every year to seeing your friends. I mean, you keep in contact, but it's just like when you come and you get to see them. And now a lot of my friends, a lot of the ACES friends I had are on Facebook. So we're reconnected on Facebook. So we see about each other's families and things like that. So it just, it was a lot of, it was about 10, 12 years that I was actively involved. And then, like I said, when I got out here to the West, Midwest and West, I got involved in another organization, and I moved in solely into online learning. But my years with starting ACES, but I was around when it started. And when we moved out of NUCEA in developing, we were such a large organization there, and a lot of the people that were coming, because it was the independent learning division, were not even in NUCEA, because they weren't part of a continuing education unit. So that was part of the drive. It's let's form our own, and ACES was formed. And I'm just so proud that it is still going, because I'm not sure what other continuing, if other organizations are keeping it strong, is still having ACES, ADEIL. It's a strong group, and I'm so glad to see that new people come in and are still enjoying it and being active in it.
Yeah. No, for me, I've just been so fortunate for the opportunities for growth, the friendships I've made, the supporting, nurturing environment.
Yeah.
And I stand on the shoulders of giants, Deb. So thank you for you and your peers, what you, that foundation that you built, that organization that you grew, that, 30 some years later, here we still are.
Still are. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been around for a long time. So, and I had a great 35-year career in, online, in distance education, from starting from print base up to where I finished as administrators and large programs. Troy had a very large program, and Ohio has a very large program. And I was, I worked for a year USD before I retired. I thought, it's just time to retire. So I did. And I went on, one of the things that when I was at a meeting with the provost, and that, it was one of our meetings with the deans and provosts. And she just asked, she asked, what is something that we don't know about you? And I said, I want to write murder mysteries. I love murder mysteries. So since I retired, I have written my first book, and it is published. And I'm working on the second. But you write about what you know. So the character is the director of an online program. Main character, and mostly based on me. It came from Pennsylvania, in the Pennsylvania Dutch area, to South Dakota. I have it, it's a fake university. Instead of Dakota State University, it's Dakota Technical Institute. But here they have become, this university has just done amazing things. It's moved into cybersecurity. So they just signed an agreement with the Army for cybersecurity. And I just had to laugh, because when I wrote the book, the main character wanted to get into a cybersecurity program and had to finish their degree at Dakota. So it's just like, I just kind of saw it coming. But so I do have a book, and it's called Cheaters Never Win.
Nice.
So when I was at Troy University, and I had to deal with, we had a lot of military students in that, because we weren't far from military bases down there in the South. So I based the two situations that happened in the book were actually disciplinary actions I had to deal with, and I just embellished them into the storyline. So the second book, I'm looking at totally online degrees. And and so it's the head of an online program is running a diploma mill. So, I'm just trying to tie the books in, not only with having a female character and that, but I'm also trying to tie in online education into this. It's based out of a university. So I wrote the first one, and Fulton Books has published it, and I'm working on the second one. So I'm still kind of active in following what the field does to keep my books going.
Good
So,
on you. That's amazing.
but it was one of my bucket lists to
Yeah.
do. The other one was my maiden name's Kennedy,
Okay.
and I don't have much of my red hair left yet. But my father was Robert Kennedy, so when I was in grade school, I used to say, the president was my uncle and stuff. But the amazing thing was that we lived on Pennsylvania Avenue, and
Oh.
the paper mill my dad worked at was 1600 Pennsylvania. So yeah, I had fun with that. I just so where was I going with that? But I just, I went from there to, wanting to know that I wanted to write, I wanted to
Mhm.
keep things going, but I just had fun with things as I went through, like, being a Kennedy. But that's where I was going. I
Yes, yes.
wanted to go to Ireland. And
Oh.
so my husband and took me on a trip to Ireland. So I wanted to, and wouldn't believe that every pub we were in there has a picture of President Kennedy
Hmm.
on the wall. And we were actually in the county where the Kennedys came from.
Oh, okay.
So got to see a little bit of the history from my background. So we enjoyed that little
Wonderful.
little side thing.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Yeah, another side thing, but going to history. So again, distance ed throughout my career has been predominantly online. And I find that the pre-online distance education just fascinating.
mm,
You mentioned in 1992 about that survey with the computers, and just kind of
mhm.
curious, was this pre-internet? Was the internet just kind of starting? Was they
It
yeah,
was,
okay.
like, I don't know, I think around 89 or so is when people started to seeing that. So
Okay.
1992, I mean, we were using the internet in the office,
Hmm. Oh
by
wow.
then. Penn State
Oh.
jumped on to doing that, and they were, I could get on the internet and do things. The computers themselves that the university supplied, well, we kind of had the green screen,
Hmm.
and
Yep.
because when I started at Penn State, my husband worked at Penn State,
Okay.
and so then after the boys were a little older and I could get them in daycare and stuff, I was looking, and I got on what they called wage payroll. That was the early on at the admissions office.
Hmm.
And so I have a picture somewhere in our stuff that I was data entering emissions data. And it was one of those computers that had, the screen was like so big, and it had green screen and
Hmm.
then the green type, and then we got to the amber because that was better for your eyes.
Oh, okay.
And so our computers, I mean, we had our computers and we could access things, and we were early in the internet there. So that's why we were looking at how many people had computers at
Yeah.
home to look at that. And that, like I said, we did that survey in 1992. They had me do that survey in 1992.
Hmm.
And then and we didn't totally jump on it yet, but that's when they started looking at designing an online course. But I was just looking at opportunities for advancement, and when I'd see things that came across the Chronicle and things like that,
Hmm. Yeah.
I saw this opportunity at Dakota State,
Yeah.
and they were, because computers are their thing, they had a lot of access. And most of our most of our courses went out. We had a big high school program,
Hmm.
and because they could get on their school computers
Yeah.
to do that. So and still to this day, my grandkids, I have older grandkids that are 22, and Raimi, who's still in school. My two grandkids, if you don't understand the ruralness of South Dakota, My granddaughter graduated in a class of 7, and my grandson
Okay.
graduated in a class of 10.
Yeah.
And and where my boys went to State College High School there at Penn
Hmm.
State,
Yep.
and like their father graduated with a class of 453, and my other son graduated in class of 575 from State
Hmm.
College High School. So it's just looking at the difference of what a high school education is. But the both of them took the college courses that high school students could take. So they graduated with all, like Ramey graduated, and they both graduated with all their gen ed courses done before
Wow.
they went to Lake Area Technical Institute. My granddaughter went into vet tech, and Ramey is in diesel mechanic. So they could step in right into those major courses because they took all their gen eds in high school.
Yeah.
And when I was a USD, we had a large high school. I mean, that has been very popular in this state of getting a lot of your gen ed courses out of the way in high school because they can count for high school credit and your college credit. So that's something that's really grown with high school students is
Yeah.
doing gen ed courses.
Hmm.
So that's what we've done here, and so even with my family, that's what my grandkids had done. So in their little high school at Ramona, South Dakota.
Yeah. Love it. Love it.
Yeah,
Another blast from the past technology. You mentioned lectures on audio tape.
yeah.
And I know this is, again, it's been a while since this sort of technology has been used. What made for a good instructional audio tape?
It really did. It had to do one that the person had a good speaking
Mm,
voice. As some
yes.
faculty members, sometimes what we get back is like this guy is so boring. Yeah, but and to relate. I mean, if they were going to do it along with the textbook, then
Hmm.
they would put in here, okay, you can follow this in your
Mm,
textbook, so you could see diagrams that way or
gotcha.
whatever, a math sample assignments. So it was helpful to do it along with with the textbook, and keeping them not too long.
Yes.
You lost the even if they made a long a long tape, they do breaks that this is just all you need for this assignment, and then you could put more than one on a 60-minute. I mean, you kept them short, you
Hmm.
kept them directed, you kept them pointed to what you wanted them to know. Video help was a lot better when you were able
Hmm.
to do a videotape,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
on the audio tapes, it's and there were especially when you were getting to like science and some of
Oh, yeah.
some of her voices and stuff. So we helped our instructional designers helped them a little bit
Hmm.
with, okay, cutting it short,
Yep.
and and directing it towards the textbook so they could see examples.
What I find fascinating, the things you've just described about working with recorded audio tapes, those are the same things that I tell instructors today with making their instructional, video lectures. And this is
Yeah,
with, high tech, you can have
yeah,
your slides right on the screen. Still
yeah.
keep it short, keep it focused. Let's be,
Focused.
economical with our time. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We were looking at that early on with just pure audio,
Yeah.
and and you had some faculty members who just didn't listen, because see, I was the one that talked to the students and found out what they
Hmm.
liked or didn't like, or who they were having an issue with, and
Hmm.
so we tried to keep that instructional design side going, and sometimes when you were well, we had an master's engineering program going, and that was tough to get those engineers to not be boring. So But
But yeah.
it's just the faculty who you work with, and and same with when I was here at Dakota State, and even though we were, like I said, we were doing things more, online or video, is when they got into computer technologies, it's just like, okay, you're dealing with an audience that can be from 18 and up, but when you're up higher in age, it's like they don't want bored to tears. They want to know what they need to know, and they want to
Yes.
get on with it. So, that's part of what you have to deal with adult learners.
Yeah, yeah. Deb, this has been just amazing. I appreciate your stories, just hearing the history of our field, both of the organization and also just what was happening in distance education during your career. This is just fascinating stuff, and I so appreciate you sharing your time and your insights.
Oh, well, thank you. And I was also glad to see that there's somebody that's still so active and ambitious and excited about still doing it. So I appreciate speaking with you too.
Thank you. Any just as we wrap up, any other memories or thoughts about our field that you'd like to share?
Oh, I just want to see it to keep going because, starting in print base and knowing the adult learners as I did, it is nice to see that not everything is still online, and there's still
Yes.
groups and populations, especially prisoner education,
Yes. Yes.
that needs to keep going. And when I moved in, I was vice provost when I was at Ohio,
Yeah.
and it was just so nice to see that their distance education unit kept correspondence courses going for the prison population.
Mm-hmm.
And and we saw that it was paying off for a lot of them. So we need to keep reaching out to all populations to help them get their education.
Love it. Deb, thank you so much. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Yeah.
Really enjoyed talking with you.
To learn more about Deb's book, Cheaters Never Win, check out the link in the video description.